During the flight to Paris, a flight attendant named Sarah Thompson was on duty. She had been working for Skyline Airlines for nearly 15 years and took pride in her professionalism. Skyline Airlines was renowned for its high-end first-class experience, making customers feel like kings and queens in the air. Sarah always took pride in being a key part of this experience, knowing exactly how to manage the expectations of the wealthy elite passengers who booked first-class tickets, treating them as if they were the only ones aboard. To Sarah, this wasn't just a job, it was a lifestyle. That evening, as passengers began boarding Flight 512 to Paris, Sarah stood at the entrance, scanning the crowd with her usual authoritative air. Her eyes followed each passenger as they approached the gate, already thinking about who would need extra attention, who might complain about the food, and who could potentially make her job harder. As she glanced over the crowd, her eyes fell upon a family that caught her attention. The family consisted of Mark and Lisa Adams along with their 2 young children. They were not flashy, but there was something about them that made Sarah take notice. Mark wore a simple navy blue suit, and Lisa had on a modest yet elegant dress. Their children were quiet and well-behaved beside them. From their appearance, they seemed like any other family who could afford first-class tickets. Yet something about them unsettled Sarah. She noticed that their boarding passes were for first class, but for some reason, she couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't belong in the premium section. It wasn't their attire. No, that was perfect. It wasn't even the polite way they addressed her. It was something else, something Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on. Her instincts kicked in, and as the family reached the front, she asked them to step aside for a moment. "Is there a problem?" Mark asked, his voice calm, but with an edge, as if he was already sensing something was off. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She scanned their tickets again. There was no mistake, but for some reason, she felt an unexplainable urge to challenge them. "I'm afraid I'll need to confirm your reservation," she said, even though the system clearly showed their tickets were valid. "There seems to be some confusion," she added, giving a polite but forced smile. Mark and Lisa exchanged a quick glance, but said nothing. They waited patiently, but warily as Sarah stepped aside to speak with a supervisor. The seconds stretched into minutes, and the tension between them thickened. Passengers behind the family grew impatient, some whispering quietly about the delay. Finally, Sarah returned, her smile colder than before. "You need to follow me," she said, but instead of leading them to the first-class section in the front of the plane, she directed them to the back near the restrooms, far from the windows with the best views. This was a subtle, calculated move, one designed to send a clear message. Sarah didn't believe this family was suited for the first-class experience she had curated. Mark remained silent. Lisa held her children's hands, not reacting to the change in seating, though the unease was evident in her eyes. She had seen this kind of treatment before, but tonight it wasn't about making a scene. It was about making it through this flight and getting to Paris. They settled into their seats. The flight began, and the plane climbed into the sky. Sarah continued her rounds, greeting passengers, offering drinks, and attending to their every need. But something in the back of her mind gnawed at her. There was something about this family, something about their presence that didn't sit right with her. She couldn't quite understand it, but she knew she needed to keep an eye on them. As the flight progressed, Sarah found herself glancing toward the Adams family more often than she intended. They were seated quietly. Mark was reading a book, Lisa helping one of the children color in a travel activity book. The younger child had fallen asleep, leaning on her mother's arm. There was nothing unusual about them. No loud voices, no unreasonable demands. If anything, they seemed more composed than many of the other first-class passengers Sarah had served in the past. Yet, she couldn't stop the nagging sense of irritation bubbling under the surface. Sarah returned to the galley where her colleague, Emily, was preparing drinks. Emily was newer to the airline, still learning the ropes, but eager to please. "Everything okay out there?" Emily asked as she placed a tray of champagne flutes on the counter. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then decided to confide in her. "You saw that family in the last row of first class, right?" she asked, lowering her voice. Emily glanced toward the section and nodded. "Yeah, they seem nice. What about them?" Sarah leaned in, her tone sharper now. "Doesn't it feel off? I mean, first class isn't cheap, and they're just, well, you know." She didn't finish her sentence, but her implication was clear. Emily frowned slightly, unsure how to respond. They have valid tickets, don't they? She asked cautiously. Emily frowned slightly, unsure how to respond. They have valid tickets, don't they? She asked cautiously. Of course, but that doesn't mean anything these days. People game the system all the time. I've seen it before, Sarah replied, her eyes narrowing. Emily didn't push further, but Sarah's words hung in the air, creating a tense silence between them. Sarah continued to stew, her agitation growing. She felt justified in her actions earlier at the boarding gate, convinced that her instincts about the family were correct. She started keeping a closer watch on them, looking for any sign of behavior that might confirm her suspicions. Meanwhile, Mark and Lisa could sense the subtle tension around them. Lisa, ever perceptive, noticed that their service was unusually slow. Other passengers had received their drinks and snacks promptly, but their row seemed to be overlooked. When they pressed the call button to request water for their daughter, it took an unusually long time for a flight attendant to respond. Lisa said nothing, but Mark leaned closer to her and whispered, "They're watching us." Lisa gave a small nod, her expression calm. "Let them," she whispered back. "We've dealt with worse." Mark sighed but didn't reply. Instead, he reached for his phone, checking his email briefly before setting it aside. He didn't want to make a scene, but he couldn't help but feel a growing frustration with the way they were being treated. This was supposed to be a relaxing, celebratory trip for their family, not an exercise in patience. Unbeknownst to Sarah, one of the other passengers in first class was observing her behavior closely. A middle-aged man in a sharp suit, seated a few rows ahead of the Addams family, had noticed the delays in their service and the barely concealed annoyance in Sarah's demeanor whenever she passed their row. He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing for now. As the flight continued, the tension in the air grew thicker. Sarah tried to refocus on her tasks, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this family was challenging her authority in ways she couldn't articulate. For the first time in years, her usual sense of control felt shaky, and she didn't like it one bit. As the dinner service began, Sarah deliberately delayed attending to the Addams row. Other first-class passengers were enjoying their gourmet meals, sipping on fine wines, and laughing softly over their conversations. Meanwhile, Mark and Lisa waited patiently, their menus still untouched on the tray table. Lisa glanced around discreetly, noticing how effortlessly the attendants catered to the other passengers. She leaned over to Mark and said quietly, "This isn't a coincidence." Mark sighed and leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "I know," he muttered, his voice carrying a measured calm, but the frustration was evident in his eyes. "But let's not give her the satisfaction of seeing us upset." At last, Sarah approached their row, her expression neutral, but her body language stiff. "I apologize for the delay," she said curtly, setting their menus down with a sharpness that was subtle but noticeable. "We've had a bit of a backlog in the galley. Can I take your order now?" Lisa smiled politely, but didn't miss a beat. "Yes, of course," she said, her tone unwavering. She and Mark placed their orders, speaking in the same calm, composed manner they had maintained since boarding. Sarah jotted down their choices quickly and left without the usual warmth she reserved for other passengers. As the meal service dragged on, Sarah's behavior didn't go unnoticed. The man in the sharp suit, now quietly sipping his whiskey, continued to observe the Addams and the lackluster service they were receiving. He seemed to weigh his thoughts carefully, deciding whether or not to intervene. Finally, when the meal was served, the Addams received their plates last. The delay was glaring, but Lisa kept her head high, cutting into her dish with practiced ease. Mark offered a small smile to his wife, appreciating her grace in the face of such obvious disrespect. Their children remained quiet, as if sensing their parents' mood and mirroring their calmness. Midway through the meal, the man in the sharp suit couldn't stay silent any longer. He flagged down Emily, who was passing by. "Excuse me," he said in a low but firm tone. "Can I ask why the family in the last row of first class was served so late? It's not hard to notice." Emily froze for a moment, her eyes darting to Sarah, who stood just a few feet away. Sarah turned toward the man, her face tightening slightly. "I assure you, sir, everything is under control," she said quickly, trying to deflect the question. The man raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by her response. Under control? It looks to me like there's a deliberate effort being made to ignore them. Do you think that's appropriate for passengers who paid for first-class service? Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly, but she forced a professional smile. I'm sorry if it appeared that way, sir. That was not the intention. The man's eyebrow arched higher, his gaze unwavering. Under control? It looks to me like there's a deliberate effort being made to ignore them. Do you think that's appropriate for passengers who paid for first-class service? Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly, but she forced a professional smile. I'm sorry if it appeared that way, sir. That was not the intention. Sarah's words hung in the air, creating a palpable tension. The man continued to stare at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, with a subtle shake of his head, he turned back to his meal, leaving Sarah feeling more rattled than before. Emily, looking uncomfortable, excused herself and retreated to the galley. As Sarah tried to regain her composure, she stole another glance at the Adams family. They weren't making a scene. They weren't complaining. Yet, somehow, their calm presence felt like a quiet rebuke, a challenge she wasn't prepared to face. For the first time that evening, Sarah began to feel the faintest pang of unease. Something about this situation felt bigger than she had anticipated, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The rest of the dinner service passed uneventfully on the surface, but the tension continued to linger in the cabin. Sarah tried to focus on her duties, moving quickly between the rows, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man's pointed comment and the Adams' unwavering composure. Every interaction with them, no matter how routine, seemed to unsettle her more. They weren't confrontational, but their silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, Mark exchanged a glance with Lisa, silently acknowledging the growing unease in the cabin. Lisa, ever the steadying presence, leaned in and whispered, "We've handled worse. Remember, let's just enjoy what we can." Her hand lightly brushed his arm, a small gesture of reassurance. Mark nodded, but his jaw remained tight. Sarah, standing near the galley, overheard snippets of the passengers' murmurs. Though no one openly criticized her, the man's earlier comment had clearly sparked quiet conversations. Sarah felt her control slipping, and with it came an uncharacteristic nervousness. She prided herself on maintaining professionalism and command in any situation. But why was this family getting under her skin? As the hours stretched on, the cabin lights dimmed for the night. Passengers began settling into their seats, some dozing off, while others watched in-flight movies. The Adams children had fallen asleep, their small heads resting on their parents' shoulders. Mark and Lisa, however, remained alert, their quiet conversation punctuated by occasional glances toward the flight attendants in the galley. Sarah couldn't keep her frustrations bottled up any longer. She turned to Emily and muttered, "I don't understand why they're acting so entitled. It's not like they're royalty." Her voice was low, but the bitterness was unmistakable. Emily, visibly uncomfortable, hesitated before replying. "I don't think they're acting entitled," she said carefully. "They're just normal passengers. Maybe we should just treat them like everyone else." Sarah shot her a sharp look. "You don't understand. I've been in this business long enough to know when something doesn't feel right." She didn't elaborate, but the words hung in the air. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but thought better of it, retreating back to the cabin instead. Unbeknownst to Sarah, Mark had quietly risen from his seat and made his way to the front of the plane. Speaking briefly with the captain's assistant, his calm demeanor hadn't wavered, but there was a quiet intensity in his request. The assistant nodded and escorted Mark to the cockpit, where he had a brief and private conversation with the captain. When Mark returned to his seat, Lisa raised an eyebrow but didn't ask. She trusted her husband's judgment and knew that whatever he had planned would be handled with the same quiet dignity they had shown all evening. Sarah, still oblivious to the conversation in the cockpit, continued her rounds. The other passengers in first class appeared relaxed, but there was a growing sense of awareness among them. Some were beginning to notice the subtle dynamics at play, the way Sarah seemed to bristle whenever she approached the Adams. Whispers grew louder, though no one confronted her directly. As the plane sailed through the night sky, The cracks in Sarah's carefully maintained facade began to show. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had underestimated this family, but she couldn't figure out why. The question gnawed at her, pulling her focus away from her duties. While she busied herself trying to maintain control of the situation, the Adams remained calm, quietly observing the events unfolding around them. Something about their stillness was unnerving, and Sarah had no idea just how much her actions were about to cost her. As the plane soared through the darkened skies, Sarah's unease continued to grow. Every glance at the Adams family seemed to unsettle her further. They weren't loud, they didn't demand anything, and yet their quiet presence felt like a challenge she couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, the cabin remained calm. Most passengers either slept or quietly watched movies. It should have been a routine flight, but Sarah could feel an invisible weight pressing down on her. In the first-class cabin, Mark adjusted his seat slightly, leaning closer to Lisa. "Everything set?" he whispered. Lisa looked at him, her expression unreadable, before giving him a small nod. She glanced at their children, still fast asleep, then back at her husband. "Are you sure this is necessary?" she asked softly. Mark gave a faint smile, the kind that carried both reassurance and resolve. "It's not about us anymore," he said. "It's about everyone who might go through this." Lisa held Mark's gaze for a moment before leaning back in her seat, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder. Meanwhile, in the galley, Sarah found herself unable to shake a nagging sense of something she couldn't quite name. She had always trusted her instincts, and tonight was no different, but instead of clarity, her thoughts were clouded by frustration and confusion. Why did this family, who had done nothing outwardly wrong, bother her so much? She convinced herself it was simply because they were challenging her authority in subtle ways. The man's calmness, the woman's quiet grace, it all felt like an affront, though she couldn't explain why. As Sarah filled out a routine report near the galley, the same passenger in the sharp suit, the one who had confronted her earlier, approached her. He held his glass of whiskey loosely in his hand, his expression sharp but calm. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice low enough not to disturb the sleeping passengers. Sarah looked up, already bracing herself for another comment. "Yes, sir. Is there something I can assist you with?" The man tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You've worked for Skyline a long time, haven't you?" "Yes, I have," Sarah replied, keeping her tone professional but curt. 15 years. Why do you ask?" The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Impressive," he said. "Then you must know how important customer experience is to this airline. I assume the Adams family in the back row paid the same premium price as the rest of us. Wouldn't you agree? They deserve the same service." Sarah's mouth tightened. She hated the way his words cut straight to the point. "Of course, sir," she said, forcing a polite tone. "All passengers are treated with equal care, aren't they?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because it doesn't look that way from where I'm sitting." Sarah's hand clenched slightly around the edge of her clipboard. "If there's a concern, I assure you it will be addressed." The man took a sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving hers. "Good," he said evenly, "because you never know who might be watching." With that, he turned and walked back to his seat, leaving Sarah standing in the galley with a growing sense of dread. She felt as though she had just been warned, though she couldn't say why. Her thoughts raced, trying to piece together what he might have meant. Did he know the family? Were they someone important? Sarah shook her head, trying to push the doubts aside. She had handled difficult passengers before, and she would handle this situation as well. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. Something about this flight was different, and she was starting to realize that she might not be the one in control after all. The hours dragged on, and Sarah's nerves began to fray. Every time she looked at the Adams family, they seemed so calm, so unbothered by the thinly veiled hostility she had shown. Their composure only added to her unease, making her feel as if they knew something she didn't. Her mind replayed the man's cryptic remark in the galley. You never know who might be watching. What had he meant, and why had he directed that comment toward her? As the plane began its gradual descent toward Paris, Sarah tried to focus on the tasks at hand. Collecting trash, assisting passengers, preparing for landing, and ensuring the cabin was secure. No matter how hard she tried to distract herself, her gaze kept drifting to the last row of first class. Mark and Lisa had woken their children, who were now quietly staring out the window, captivated by the city lights far below. Lisa was adjusting her daughter's blanket while Mark checked something on his phone, his expression as calm and measured as ever. In the back of her mind, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. It wasn't just the Adams' quiet presence. It was the way some of the other passengers had started glancing their way, whispering amongst themselves. The tension in the air had shifted, and Sarah felt as though she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't control. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, the passengers in first class began gathering their belongings, readying themselves to disembark. Sarah noticed Mark slip his phone into his pocket before exchanging a quick glance with Lisa. The look between them was subtle but deliberate, as if they had silently agreed on their next steps. Sarah busied herself, ensuring that the other passengers were ready to leave, but her ears remained attuned to any sign of movement from the Adams family. Finally, the moment came. As the cabin doors opened, Sarah moved toward the exit to bid farewell to the first-class passengers. Her professional smile firmly in place, the passengers began filing out, thanking her and the rest of the crew for their service. The man in the sharp suit passed by her, giving her a long, pointed look but saying nothing. When it was the Adams family's turn, Sarah stiffened slightly. Mark paused, looking her directly in the eye. "Thank you for the flight," he said in a tone so polite and measured that it made Sarah's stomach tighten. "Thank you for the flight," he said in a tone so polite and measured that it made Sarah's stomach tighten. Lisa offered a similar courteous nod, her gaze steady and unreadable. Sarah forced a smile and nodded back. "You're welcome," she said quickly, eager for them to move on. As they exited, Mark turned briefly to look back at the cabin, his expression thoughtful. Sarah couldn't tell if it was a gesture of farewell or something else entirely. It left her feeling strangely exposed, as though the thin layer of control she had tried to maintain throughout the flight had been quietly stripped away. Moments after the last first-class passenger left, one of the flight attendants approached Sarah with a puzzled expression. "The captain wants to see you in the cockpit," she said, her voice hushed. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Now what for?" she asked, trying to sound composed. "I don't know," the attendant replied, shrugging. "But he said it was urgent." Sarah felt a jolt of panic, but quickly smoothed her expression. She adjusted her uniform, took a deep breath, and headed toward the cockpit. She told herself it was probably a routine matter, something minor that could be resolved quickly. But as she walked through the empty first-class cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was about the Adams family and that whatever was waiting for her in the cockpit would change everything. Sarah stepped into the cockpit. The usual hum of the plane systems filled the small, confined space. The captain, a composed and seasoned man named Captain Harris, was seated with the co-pilot beside him, both reviewing final landing procedures. As Sarah entered, Captain Harris looked up, his expression unreadable. "You wanted to see me, Captain?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice steady. She clasped her hands in front of her, attempting to maintain her usual professionalism. Captain Harris nodded toward the empty jump seat. "Take a seat, Sarah," he said. Her heart thudded as she sat, glancing nervously between the two men. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice faltering. Captain Harris exhaled deeply, folding his hands on the console in front of him. "Rebecca, we've received a message from corporate," he began, his voice calm but firm. "It concerns the passengers in row 1G and 1H. Sarah's stomach dropped. She didn't respond immediately, her mind racing. What message? Why now? She had handled the situation discreetly, or so she thought, the Adams family. Captain Harris clarified, watching her reaction closely. "They're not just passengers, Rebecca. They're owners." Sarah blinked, her mind struggling to process his words. "Owners?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Harris said, his tone sharpening slightly. "Mark and Lisa Adams are the majority stakeholders in Skyline Airlines. They recently acquired the company as part of their broader investment portfolio. This flight was one of their first incognito evaluations of staff performance, and from the reports I've been receiving, their experience wasn't exactly up to standard. Sarah's breath caught. Her thoughts spiraled as the weight of his words hit her. Owners, the very family she had subtly discriminated against throughout the flight, didn't just buy tickets, they owned the airline. A cold sweat broke out on her brow as she pieced together the implications of her actions. Every delay, every slight, every dismissive glance. It had all been noticed, not just by the Adams, but likely by the other passengers as well. A cold sweat broke out on her brow as she pieced together the implications of her actions. Every delay, every slight, every dismissive glance. It had all been noticed, not just by the Adams, but likely by the other passengers as well. Captain Harris's words echoed in her mind, amplifying the weight of her actions. Captain Rebecca started, her voice shaky. I wasn't aware that's the problem. Harris interrupted, his tone cutting. You weren't aware because you didn't bother to treat them with the same respect you showed other passengers. And now I'm afraid this situation is out of my hands. The Adams have requested a meeting with you before leaving the airport. Sarah's hands gripped the armrests of the seat, her knuckles white. A meeting? She asked, her voice cracking. Captain, surely it's not up for debate. Harris said firmly, this is a corporate directive. I'd suggest you prepare yourself to explain your behavior. Sarah sat frozen, her mind reeling. A meeting with the owners. People she had disrespected, judged, and dismissed without a second thought. The very foundation of her confidence, her authority, felt like it was crumbling beneath her. She opened her mouth to protest, but quickly realized there was no point. She wasn't in control anymore. Captain Harris stood, signaling that their conversation was over. They're waiting in the VIP lounge, he said. I'll escort you there personally. Let's get this over with. Sarah rose slowly, her legs trembling beneath her as she followed Harris out of the cockpit. The reality of the situation fully sank in. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was the kind of moment that could end her career, and she had no one to blame but herself. Sarah followed Captain Harris down the jet bridge, her heart pounding with every step. The fluorescent lights above seemed harsher than usual, casting stark shadows that mirrored the dread pooling in her chest. She struggled to maintain her composure, but the whispers of the cabin crew, who had clearly caught wind of the situation, only deepened her discomfort. As they approached the VIP lounge, the glass doors slid open with a soft hiss. Sarah's eyes immediately landed on Mark and Lisa Adams seated in the plush armchairs of the private space. Mark was relaxed, his legs crossed, one arm draped casually over the chair. Lisa sat upright, her posture graceful but commanding, her expression unreadable. Their children were absent, likely being attended to elsewhere, leaving the couple fully focused on what was about to unfold. Captain Harris gestured for Sarah to step inside, but the weight of the moment kept her frozen in place for a second too long. Go ahead, he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. Sarah finally stepped forward, her polished heels clicking against the marble floor. Her usual air of confidence had vanished, replaced by the overwhelming realization that she was about to answer to the very people she had judged and mistreated. She stood before them, suddenly hyper-aware of how small and powerless she felt. Mark glanced up, his expression calm but piercing. He nodded toward the chair across from him. Have a seat, he said simply. Sarah lowered herself into the chair, clasping her hands tightly in her lap to stop them from trembling. Lisa leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady but unyielding. Rebecca, she asked, her tone cool but polite. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt a flush of humiliation creeping up her neck, but forced herself to meet Lisa's gaze. Mark exchanged a brief glance with his wife before turning his attention back to Sarah. I'd like to start by asking you a simple question, he said, his voice measured. Why do you think we're here? Sarah hesitated, swallowing hard. She wanted to deflect, to shift the conversation away from her actions, but she knew there was no escape. I understand there were issues during the flight, James started, her voice faltering. I may have mishandled certain aspects of your service, she admitted, each word feeling like it was dragged from her throat. Mishandled? Lisa repeated, her tone laced with incredulity. She exchanged another look with Mark, who exhaled deeply before leaning forward. Rebecca, he said, his voice soft but firm. This isn't about a delayed drink order or a less-than-ideal seat assignment. This is about respect, or in this case, the lack of it. Throughout that entire flight, you treated us as though we didn't belong. Am I wrong? Sarah opened her mouth to deny it, but stopped herself. There was no point in lying. They had seen through her actions just as she had feared. No, sir, she admitted quietly. You're not wrong. No, sir, she admitted quietly. You're not wrong. Lisa tilted her head slightly, her expression shifting from stern to something resembling disappointment. Do you know how many times we've encountered this kind of treatment? She asked, her voice calm but cutting. We've worked hard to build a life where we don't have to justify our presence. But people like you still make us feel as though we're trespassing. Why is that? Sarah's throat tightened, and she couldn't muster a response. Lisa's words cut deeper than she expected, forcing her to confront the unspoken biases she had buried beneath years of polished professionalism. Mark leaned back, his gaze unwavering. This isn't just about us, he said. It's about every passenger who's been made to feel less than because of someone else's prejudice. As owners, we have a responsibility to ensure that this kind of behavior doesn't exist on our airline. And after today, I'm not sure you belong here. Sarah's eyes widened, panic flooding her chest. Mr. Adams, please, she stammered. This was a mistake, a lapse in judgment. I've been with Skyline for 15 years. I'm good at my job. I can learn from this. Mark studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Lisa, however, was less reserved. You've been here for 15 years, she said, her voice sharp. But what have you learned in that time? Clearly not how to treat people with respect. Sarah's heart sank further. The silence that followed was deafening, and she realized that no carefully chosen words or excuses would undo the damage she had caused. The control she had so carefully cultivated during the flight was gone, replaced by an unshakable truth. She had misjudged them, and now she was facing the consequences. Mark finally broke the silence. We'll take this matter to corporate, he said calmly. Your actions today will be reviewed, and a decision will be made about your future with Skyline. But understand this. Your behavior is unacceptable, and it reflects poorly not just on you, but on the entire company. That's something we can't ignore. Sarah nodded, her hands trembling in her lap. She wanted to plead further, to defend herself, but she knew it would only make things worse. Instead, she sat in silence, the weight of their words sinking in as the reality of her actions settled over her like a heavy fog. Sarah nodded, her hands trembling in her lap. She wanted to plead further, to defend herself, but she knew it would only make things worse. Instead, she sat in silence, the weight of their words sinking in as the reality of her actions settled over her like a heavy fog. Sarah felt exposed, as though every unspoken thought, every subtle bias she had acted on, was laid bare for the world to see. For the first time in her 15 years with Skyline, she felt genuinely powerless. Mark leaned forward again, his calm demeanor unshaken. Rebecca, he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her flinch slightly. We're not here to humiliate you. This isn't about revenge or making a spectacle of what happened. This is about accountability. Sarah nodded stiffly, unsure if she should respond. Her throat felt dry, and her thoughts scrambled for anything that could salvage her position. I understand that my actions were inappropriate, and I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you and your family. She started, her voice cracking. She cleared her throat and tried again. I understand that my actions were inappropriate, and I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you and your family. Lisa's gaze remained steady, her expression unreadable. Sorry isn't enough, Rebecca, she said firmly. Apologies don't undo the harm caused. What matters is what you choose to do moving forward. Words are easy. Change isn't. Sarah swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the hem of her blazer. She wanted to protest, to insist that she wasn't the person they thought she was, but deep down, she knew there was truth in Lisa's words. She had let her biases dictate her actions, and now she was paying the price. Mark leaned back slightly, his tone softening but still firm. Here's what's going to happen. Lisa and I will be reporting this incident to corporate, and they will decide the next steps. Whether or not you stay with this airline is out of our hands, but know this. Your behavior tonight has set a standard we can't ignore. Sarah nodded mutely, feeling a hollow ache in her chest. She had spent her career climbing the ranks, priding herself on her professionalism, only to have it unravel in a single flight. Her silence stretched on, but the Adams didn't fill it. They simply waited, their calm, composed presence amplifying the weight of her guilt. Finally, Lisa stood, adjusting her coat with a quiet elegance that only deepened Sarah's shame. "We've said what we needed to," Lisa said, her voice cool but resolute. "What happens next is up to you, Rebecca. Think carefully about how you carry this forward." Mark stood as well, extending his hand towards Sarah. She hesitated for a moment before shaking it, his grip firm but measured. "Good luck," he said simply, his tone devoid of malice but filled with finality. As the Adams walked out of the lounge, Sarah sat motionless, her mind a storm of regret and self-recrimination. The echoes of their footsteps faded, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the cold, hard truth her actions had brought her to this point. There was no one to blame but herself. Captain Harris re-entered the lounge a moment later, his expression a mixture of professionalism and pity. "Rebecca," he said evenly, "Corporate will contact you in the morning. For now, I suggest you take the rest of the week to reflect on this." Sarah nodded silently, rising to her feet as she left the lounge. The reality of the situation hit her with full force. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for, was now on the line, and it was all because she had let her prejudices dictate her actions. The pristine world she had built for herself suddenly felt fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse. Sarah walked through the bustling airport terminal, her steps heavy and unsteady. The usual buzz of travelers, families reuniting, professionals rushing to their gates, announcements echoing overhead, all felt distant, like static noise in the background of her thoughts. Her mind replayed the Adams' words over and over, each one cutting deeper than the last. The weight of their calm, deliberate confrontation felt heavier than any shouting match could have. She reached the employee parking lot and climbed into her car, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored. For a moment, she just sat there, staring blankly at the dashboard, her thoughts a chaotic mess. The Adams' faces, calm, composed, yet filled with quiet disappointment, floated in her mind. She wanted to be angry, to blame them for her predicament, but she couldn't. She knew that every choice she had made during that flight had led to this. The drive home was a blur, the city lights streaming past her windows like faint streaks. She barely registered the turns, her body moving on autopilot while her mind spiraled deeper into self-reflection. It wasn't just about this one incident. She realized there had been other moments, smaller ones, where her actions might have been influenced by biases she had refused to acknowledge. The Adams had simply been the first to call her out on it so openly, forcing her to confront what she had ignored for years. When she finally pulled into her driveway, the house felt colder and eerier than usual. Sarah sat in her car for a long moment, unable to bring herself to go inside. She knew that the quiet of her home would only amplify the storm in her head. Eventually, she gathered herself and walked inside, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. She dropped her bag by the door and collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling as the reality of her situation settled over her like a heavy fog. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her out of her thoughts. She hesitated before picking it up, dreading what awaited her. It was an email from Skyline's corporate office. The subject line read immediate review of employee conduct. Sarah's stomach tightened as she opened the email. The message was brief but clear. It confirmed that the Adams had filed an official report and outlined the steps that would follow: a meeting with HR, a formal review of her behavior on the flight, and a temporary suspension pending the outcome. There was no mention of termination, but the possibility loomed heavily between the lines.